Welcome back to Out of the Fog. Before the break, we told you a bit about former CBC Here and Now co-anchor Jonathan Crowe's decision to retire after 31 years to take on a new job as a journalism teacher at the College of the North Atlantic. And to tell us more about his decision and his new job and, you know, how everything is going, John joins me now in studio. Great to have you here.
Hi, thanks for having me. This is a first.
Not
a first for you and me, of course, because
No.
we worked together a long time ago at CBC.
We did indeed.
It's actually 31 years, 6 months and 3 days, but who's counting, right?
You're down to the day.
Well, not down. I'm just kidding. But yeah, it was about 31 years and 6 months. I can't believe it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So what does I have to ask you before we talk about now
Yeah.
this new career and everything? What's it like being on the other side? Because normally
Being
you're
here?
yeah. Because normally you're the one asking the questions.
It's a bit odd. Yeah, yeah. I was going to ask you for a list of the questions beforehand and all that stuff, but I trust you.
There. Thank you. Thank you for that. We'll see how much you trust me now after we get through this. So tell us, 31 years.
Yeah.
Was that a hard decision to make?
It was because I'm a confirmed chicken, and I always said, I guess about 10 years ago, I had done some work with students at Memorial University, just a couple of sessions every winter with them on-camera performance and writing and stuff. Mm-hmm. And I always said that I would want to get into teaching after broadcasting was done. And this opportunity came along. And so I had to make a decision. And my decision, I think, was sort of made for me when the phone rang and they offered me the job. And it was like, I got to do this. I was excited about it. And
so there wasn't you weren't really questioning too much?
I was questioning. What I did a lot of questioning, like leading up to it. You know, I had my interview in October, and I had a lot of time to think about it. Mm-hmm. I felt that things went well in the interview, and I felt that maybe they were going to offer me something. So I did all that kind of agonizing in those few months leading up to the whole thing. And you know, there were days when I thought, oh no, you can't leave the CBC, and there were other days when I thought, well, you know, this is a huge opportunity. It's a chance to do something that you've always wanted to do. Don't be such a chicken. You know, go for it.
So you're kind of giving yourself a pep talk along the way.
And a couple of people close to me gave me pep talks and said they thought that I might be good at it. Now the jury's out on that, but I'm finding my way. But in the end, when I got the phone call, this feeling of excitement came over me that I hadn't felt in a long, long time. And I had to do it. And what did I have to lose, really? I mean, I had put in 31 years at CBC. Now, I mean, there's some tough things about it. I was very close to most of the people that I worked with, and I miss working with Debbie and Ryan. So Debbie called me. We're going to go for beer. I see Ryan a couple of times a week.
Well, you guys are playing hockey.
We play hockey together. But really, I miss some of the people more than anything. Mm-hmm. I'm excited about my new job. You know, I guess the idea was it was more looking ahead than looking back.
Right. I want to touch on, of course, you worked alongside with Debbie and Ryan. Yeah. And I was saying in the introduction, and I mean, I know you guys personally, but even as somebody who watches the news every night, you see that connection that is made, and you know, you guys truly have a great relationship, both on and off the air. Yeah. So I'm just curious, like, just tell me a little bit about that relationship and you know how those decisions kind of play a role in moving.
Well, when I first met Ryan, when he came in 2008. He reminded me so much of myself when I first came here. You know, we were around the same age, and I don't know. It was more like it wasn't quite a father-son relationship because I am old enough to be his dad, but we became great friends, and I don't know. We just clicked, and you know, there was, I think, some magic there. There was some chemistry there, and we truly liked each other, or we like each other. And I think that came across on the air. It's something that you can't manufacture. It was very, very difficult saying goodbye to him, saying goodbye to Debbie. I mean, Debbie, the last night, you know, there was sort of this 2-week lead up because I told my boss I was leaving a couple of weeks before I left. It was fairly quick because they wanted me to start at my new job on the 3rd of January. And I didn't really have time to process it all because I was involved in kind of the nuts and bolts of saying goodbye to the CBC and starting a new job and filling out forms and stuff. And I remember on the last evening I was on the air, Debbie and I were in the studio together recording the birthdays and anniversaries, about to record the birthdays and anniversaries, and I looked across at her and I burst into tears. And she said, "Oh, stop." She said, "I'm not even looking at you, you know?" Yeah. And I think that, you know, I worked with her very closely for 11 years, and Ryan, you know, since 2008. And we're great friends, you know, and, you know, Debbie and I have, you know, we've shared trips together, and we've had, you know, we've had glasses of wine together, and we've had meals together, and we've talked about a lot of things, and, you know, even stuff outside of work. And
that trust is there.
Yeah, yeah.
And you build upon that with the people that you work with.
And I remember one of the greatest compliments Debbie ever paid me was, she said to me one night on the air, she never felt like I would let her down. And you know, I felt the same way about her. Right. So Deb, call me. I haven't seen much of her since I left, because of course we're both busy, but we keep threatening to go out for beer or something.
Right, it'll happen, I'm sure.
It'll happen, yeah.
So 31 years, you know, when you reflect back on everything that you did, I do want to kind of go back to the early days, because you essentially, as you said in one of your articles, you grew up within the CBC.
I did.
You started off in your 20s.
I did. I started off as a casual, like we all start off at the CBC. Well, I keep saying these days, I mean 30 odd years ago. 1983 was the first time I walked into the CBC in Montreal, and I got my first contract in '84, and I had a full-time job as in the mailroom of a large company in Montreal during the week, and I would work at CBC on the weekends and make more money on the weekends than I made during the week. And I learned a lot about television. I was a production assistant, and I learned about television from the ground up. So yeah, I was 23 when I first walked into the CBC.
So that was in Montreal, but you did like a mock sportscast, which
did.
Landed you here in St. John's.
I still have the tape in my drawer, and when I get to know my students better, they might get a little look at it. Yeah. So what I did was, you know, I used to follow reporters out when they were on shoots and do my own story, and a friend of mine got me into the studio and put me in a shirt and tie, and I wrote intros and I put together my own reel. And then a job came open in St. John's, and I knew nothing about Newfoundland. I literally knew one Newfoundlander. He was a friend of my dad's, and you know, apparently nobody at HR in Montreal knew about Newfoundland either, because they sent my tape to St. John, New Brunswick, first off.
I'm sure that still happens.
Yeah, and anyway, so I got a fill-in sportscaster job here. I filled in for Doug Leto, who actually did. Yeah, I mean, Doug's probably done as many jobs at the CBC as I have. He was doing sports at the time, and he had gone over to assignment, so they brought me in for the summer. And the only reason I knew I had a full-time job was when a photographer contacted me and said, "We want to do the pictures in September, and we want to do your pictures." So I figured, well, I must have the job, right? So, you know, and I went from there. So I ended up doing, you know, all sorts of things.
Right, and eventually worked your way up.
Yeah.
What was it, I guess, that intrigued you about journalism or, you know, TV, sharing stories?
Well, you know, the first thing and this is very, very basic. I remember when I walked into the CBC in Montreal, I was a typical kid, right? Got out of university, had a bachelor's in political science, didn't know what I wanted to do. I wanted to write, but that's pretty vague. Everybody wants to write. And I managed to get into the CBC and get in, you know, somebody liked something that I had written, so I went in this one particular day and I got shown around, and I remember walking into an editing suite and thinking, man, this is magic. It's magic. And that's what I always loved about television, was there's a whole magic to it. There's a magic to the shooting and the editing and all the behind the scenes stuff. You know, as we sit here, you know, it's a set, and there's all these things behind the scenes, like cameras and teleprompters and monitors and people, you know, that the viewers never see at home, but they're the people who put you on the air. So there's this whole kind of almost like a showbiz air to it. And then there's journalism, which is, you know, I was privileged enough first with sports and then with news and current affairs, to travel all over Newfoundland and to travel to places where Newfoundlanders were doing things, which was really, really cool. And so you get people to tell you their stories, and I'm sure that, when you nail an interview, you know it. It's a good feeling. When you go out and you do a story and you shoot a story and you have to travel to go and do it, and you get somebody to talk to you and basically tell you their deepest, darkest thoughts, there's a great feeling to that, a great satisfaction. And I always loved the storytelling aspect of it. And I love the performing aspect of it, because I'm a strange mixture. I'm an introvert at heart, but I'm actually I'm part show off too. So
you don't say.
Yeah.
I'm just joking.
Yeah. Well, we won't get into that, Erin.
Curious as to, at that time, and when you were getting into journalism, or you found out that, your writing led you to journalism, that's what you wanted to do. You became a, sports reporter.
Yeah.
Was the anchor chair something that you strived for? Was that ever in, I guess, the plan?
No, it wasn't, because it was always, it was easy to get typecast as a sports reporter. And I remember I filled in on News Final, which was the late news at the time, reading news. And I remember a former boss of mine saying, "Yeah, you'll never be I don't see you as a news host, right?" I was kind of going down the producer path in the early 2000s, and then CBC St. John's was lucky enough to get involved in this digital TV experiment that CBC got into, the Country Canada channel. And it was at that point, riding Doug Leto's coattails again. Doug was the host of this show called Countrywide. It was a current affairs show for rural Canada. Great idea. And Doug went on vacation, and they asked me, would I fill in? And so I found one of my old suits. I could barely fit into it. And I realized that I loved being on the air, And so I kind of got the bug, and then I would fill in for Debbie, because she was on the other side of the newsroom doing Canada Now at the time, which was that terrible half-hour experiment that CBC got into in the early 2000s. And so she was doing that, and I would fill in for her, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I was lucky enough when we went back to the 1 hour format to be the co-host with Deb. I did that for 11 years. So I loved hosting. Yeah, it was great.
I find it hard when people ask, what has been your favorite interview? And there's been so many over 31 years, but what have been, I guess, or what is the highlight, or some of the highlights for you?
Wow. I'll never forget, there's a couple of stories I'll never forget. I went out and it was the 70th anniversary, so it was 99, the 70th anniversary of the Great Tidal Wave down on the Burin Peninsula. And one of the things that I was lucky to do, and I remember you did the same job when you were at CBC, is I was a video journalist. I got to shoot my own stories. And I went down to the Burin Peninsula, and I met this lovely woman who was a little girl when the tidal wave hit, and she lived on an island just not far from the community of Burin. And her neighbor's house had been swept away, and her little friend with it. And we went across, it was a lovely fall day, and we went across in a boat, and we walked around the site where her house was and her friend's house was. Absolutely unforgettable to hear her story. So that's one that I remember. A particular interview that I remember, I got to interview all my heroes, including Guy Lafleur. I got to interview, I remember probably one of the best interviews I felt I did was with Ed Byrne after the constituency spending scandal. I was proud of that because I felt that I held him to account. And his lawyer called me a very rude name afterwards, so that was a great compliment, I felt. His lawyer is a good friend of mine, actually. And then there were sad stories. The saddest story that stands out for me is those Pooch Cove drownings in the late 90s, where 3 boys drowned. That really, there's times I can't get that out of my head because And the scene that's etched in my mind is when Coast Guard found one of the boys, in the ice, and this was a couple of days later, and Eddie Kennedy, who's a great cameraman, was shooting the scene as the rescue, as the Coast Guard guy got lowered, and he started to pull something out of the ice, and we realized it was one of the boys, and I turned around and I saw all his classmates watching, and I'll never forget that. And anybody who thinks that journalists don't have a heart or don't feel things, I mean, it's just not true. Those stories affect all of us in ways that we don't even know at the time, right?
Right.
So there's been, and I got to travel to, the Montreal Canadiens training camp and follow Terry Ryan when he was a rookie. I got to go to Iceland, to Reykjavik, to cover, the 100th anniversary of Leif the Lucky coming to Newfoundland. Or so the tourism people like to think, right? I mean, There's some debate over where he actually did land. So I got to do a whole lot of things that stick in my mind. But Erin, the thing that I remember the most when I think about working at the CBC is some of the people that I met doing stories, but mostly it's some of the great people that I worked with. And I think that would make sense, I suppose, to anybody who's worked closely with people, and you work kind of intensely with people when you go on the road with a cameraman, when you're stuck in an editing suite with an editor. So I worked with some great people, and many of them on the technical side. I think of some of the great cameramen that we all learned from, like Lloyd Pennell and Sterling Snow, Kevin Hanlon, who worked here for years. Just some great characters, and we had so much fun and so many laughs. So those are the things that stick in my mind.
Let's talk about your new career.
Yeah.
So how are things going? You're a few weeks, or I guess almost a month and a half in now.
We're going to be we're almost at midterm. It's been scary, but it's been fun scary, because it's the first time in a long time that I've felt kind of almost like out of control at times, right? Do I know what I'm doing here? Am I getting through to people? And the most satisfying part of it is I guess passing on. Like over the last 31 years, I have learned a few things. I do know a few things, and the fun part is realizing that I do have a fair bit of knowledge about the business. Having said that, the business is constantly changing and evolving. So the challenge over the next few years will be to keep abreast of those changes now that I'm not working in the business. And I really, really enjoy the students. We've got about 20 students, and they're all great people. And some of them are, have come from other careers and are trying journalism because it's their dream. Some are doing it because they've always wanted to do it. So it's a really cool atmosphere, and I work with a couple of great instructors, so they're showing me the ropes. So, but at first, the first couple of weeks, it was like, oh my gosh, I think I had a handle on something, and then somebody would say, oh, have you remembered to do this? And just today, it was like, I was with somebody and I said, wow, there's a midterm exam? Oh my gosh, I got to start thinking about that, So I don't think I've done as much thinking in the last 6 weeks. I've done more thinking in the last 6 weeks than I have in probably the previous 6 years, because when you do a job for 11 years, you kind of, you know how to do things.
There's somewhat of a comfort there.
There's a comfort level. Yeah. So I'm out of my comfort zone at times.
Which is a good thing.
It is a good thing. And I feel rejuvenated, and I feel, the great thing about working with students is they make you feel young, and they keep you honest. They really keep you honest. If they're not happy about a mark, they're going to ask you why. So there's that accountability factor too. And you get to play with cameras and editing and stuff, which is all stuff that I love, right?
You mentioned just a few minutes ago about, you know, journalism and how it's changed.
Yeah.
It has evolved so
Yeah.
much, especially when you bring in the internet and
Yeah.
even how social media plays a
Yeah.
role. You know, this could be a loaded question here, but you know, what do you think about the change of journalism and what you've seen over the past, say, 30 years? You know,
I think I do worry that that we kind of go for the clickbait a little bit. But having said that, I think what's happening now with the whole Trump business is that I think journalism is going to make a comeback. You know, I think that
now is kind of more a time than ever that
that you're going to see a return to, you know, people on the internet or people in the social media business like to talk about the mainstream media. Well, the mainstream media do their jobs ethically. They get more than one source for their story. They get sued, you know, they're worried about getting sued, so they take care of that. You know, the mainstream media actually do things properly, right? So there's a lot to be said for that. And I think there's going to be a bounce back. You know, the internet is a great tool. It's a medium. And I think, you know, for instance, I think it was the Washington Post recently hired more journalists. So I think you're going to see a return to journalism. I think you're going to see more young people wanting to get back into it. And I think more than ever, there's a need for people to dig into stories. I mean, people want that. I mean, there's a reason why documentaries are so popular on Netflix, for instance. So, you know, I think that whilst the medium is changing, I don't think, you know, I don't think that there's any substitute for what journalists do, and I think there's a greater need than ever, particularly since, I mean, I feel that in the United States, you know, there's a tendency now towards the undemocratic, and one of the pillars of democracy is a strong media that holds leaders and people in positions of authority accountable, and I think that people are demanding that now. I mean, you know, what I'm seeing south of the border is it's actually good for journalism.
All right. I don't mean to cut you off there, but we have 1 minute left.
Oh, really?
Time has flown by during this conversation.
Yeah.
I know. I just want to know any regrets about this move? And you know,
absolutely not. Absolutely not. You know, we got nominated. Here and Now got nominated for 2 Canadian Screen Awards. And on that day when I found out that Ryan and myself and Debbie had been nominated, I did feel something. But then I had to talk to myself and I said, well, you know, you're gone now. You're moving on. And I think that it's very important not to have any regrets, to think about moving forward instead of what's in the rearview mirror. So no regrets.
We're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank you very much for joining me here this evening.
You're welcome, anytime.